for Youth and Young Adults for Mennonite Church USA, and also the editor of The Gathering Place, which is an interactive website for Anabaptist youth leaders to learn, be, and connect. And you can join the Gathering Place community at www.thegatheringplace.us. Every month here in the Gathering Place, we have a different theme that we talk about, and everything that we do throughout that month hinges upon that theme. This month, we've been talking about special needs ministry, and I'm so excited to have Janeen Bertsche Johnson from Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary with us today to do our webinar. And she's going to be talking about autism in our youth group and what are some characteristics of autism, and how these factors might affect a youth group and ways that youth leaders can work at addressing them. So welcome, Janeen. Thanks so much for being a part of the Gathering Place today. We look forward to hearing what you have to share with us.
Thanks. It's good to be with all of you, whether you're joining live or listening to this later. Just a little bit about myself. I've been in ministry for 27 years now, 21 of those at AMBS. And before that, for 6 years, I was in the Lorraine Avenue Mennonite Church in Wichita, Kansas. And one of the responsibilities I had there was youth ministry. So I continue a passion for how to relate to youth and young adults, although now I'm working more with the young adult spectrum, or young adults. My personal investment in the issue of autism has been very close to us. When our daughter, our oldest child, was 7 years old, she was diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder, one that was rather mild, called pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, and that category no longer exists in the new DSM. Now it's just autism spectrum disorder. But we have had an interesting, sometimes challenging, many times fulfilling journey with our daughter as she has grown up with this, and she's now almost 24. So I bring that as part of my experience. Also, a group of parents in the Goshen area decided to start a parent support group about 9 years ago. And I've been part of the steering committee for that group, and we've had regular meetings over those 9 years to resource parents. We have a Facebook page, the Autism Asperger group of a support group of Goshen, and we have over 300 members of that Facebook page. So I'm glad to talk a little bit. I am not a psychologist, so I am hoping to draw on all of the wisdom that this group brings, and I will ask several times if there are other things you want to add or comments or questions that you have. And if I don't know the answer to something right now, I will do my best to find out. So basically, autism spectrum disorders, which sometimes are abbreviated ASDs, are a range of neurological and biological disorders that are first evident in children between the ages of 18 months and 5 years. Things that show up later usually are called something else. Now, sometimes people don't recognize the symptoms at that early age, especially before more recently. Many children and youth were not diagnosed until much later in life. I know of people who were not diagnosed until they were in their 30s or 40s. But now, in order to be called this, you generally have to be able to say that, yeah, something wasn't going right when they were very young. Because it's a spectrum, autism affects each individual differently and at different levels of severity. So some people on the spectrum are severely affected and have little or no language and require major care. Others have less severe symptoms, function fairly normally, although I would say the challenges are there, they're just more hidden. There's a saying that we hear often in the world that says, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. So the characteristics will be different for each person. The numbers of who is affected now, some studies are saying 1 in 88 children, others are saying 1 in 68 children. When our daughter was diagnosed 17, 18 years ago, That was 1 in 250. So you can see that the numbers have just exploded over the last several years, and there's not agreement on why that has happened, whether there actually are more cases or there's just better testing and identification. So what I'm going to do today is talk about 5 major clusters of characteristics that we see with people on the autism spectrum. And then as we talk about each one of those, we're going to just kind of reflect together on how they might affect a youth program and what strategies youth leaders might try to address them. And it's okay if we come back and touch on things later as well. If we think of something, some of these overlap pretty majorly, so it's kind of hard to do this without repeating ourselves somewhat. But the first cluster of characteristics that must be present in order for someone to be given the ASD label, if you would, or diagnosis, is communication difficulties. So there are a variety of different kinds of difficulties. For some, it's a delay of language. For some, it's an absence of language. It might be poor eye contact. There's often an auditory processing delay, which means that there's a gap between hearing something and understanding something and responding to something. So when you speak to someone on the spectrum, you might get kind of this blank moment there while they're trying to make sense of what they have heard and then put together a response and give it back to you. And that delay can be rather significant. It makes it very difficult, for example, then, for someone with an autism spectrum disorder to take notes in a classroom because they're trying to listen, and normally speakers keep going and keep going and keep going. And about the time they have kind of processed what they have heard, there's something else being said. So it's very challenging for many of these folks to take notes because that requires them to add the extra layer of writing something down as well. When my daughter was in school, she would basically write down everything that was put on the board. That was all she got. If it was put on the board, and she didn't often have a clue what it was about. And so we got a piece of technology called a smart pen, and it would record what was being said as she took those notes. And then I could listen to that recording. I would tap on the notebook, and it would play back the audio of what the teacher was saying as she was writing down those notes. And then I would add in all of the extra notes so that Hannah could read them and study those. So that's just an example of what the auditory processing delay means. Another form of communication difficulty is repetitive use of language. That may or may not be present, but sometimes people will use the same word many times. A very common one is difficulty in starting or sustaining a conversation with other people. For example, it might be difficult for them to know how to initiate a conversation or how to stay on topic. They don't always understand how to take turns. Some of those just general things that most people pick up just through absorbing them, they have to be intentionally taught. Folks with autism spectrum disorders don't absorb very much. It has to be practiced. It has to be taught. We learned when Hannah was quite young that she didn't know how to make a phone call. So we actually had her learn the steps of making a phone call. And she just hadn't picked that up by watching us. Also, there's often a lack of response to verbal cues, and also then other kinds of cues like body language as well. So just because a teacher says something to the whole class or a youth leader says something to a whole group does not necessarily mean that the person with an autism spectrum disorder would realize that they are included in that. Another characteristic of the communication difficulty is taking things literally. So jokes, sarcasm are very difficult for these folks to understand. or they might get it really late if they've been taught how to decipher a joke. And they also have problems with abstract language. So concrete learning is much easier, but abstract thought, which unfortunately includes most aspects of faith, is much harder for them to kind of process. And depending on the person, they might respond to that very differently. I know people on the autism spectrum who experience faith very much through their feelings, through their participation in a body, and others for whom it's very frustrating if they can't make sense of every logical piece of it. So it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone responds to faith conversations the same way. It's just that abstract thinking is more challenging for most of them. As I said earlier, misunderstanding body language, and sometimes there's an unusual voice tone or volume. So some people speak more woodenly or speak too loudly, don't moderate their voice tone. So are there other characteristics related to communication difficulties that you are aware of, or do you have questions about those? And then we'll talk about how they might affect a youth program. Okay. Just jump in if you do have a question. So how do communication difficulties affect youth groups? Well, one thing I thought of was that as we're teaching in a youth setting, whether it's a Sunday school setting or a youth group conversation about something, that it often helps to use something visual rather than just the verbal explanations. So where it's possible to use visual supports, that helps. Concrete language is helpful as much as possible. And avoiding idioms, and also avoiding rhetorical questions. They may not understand that what we're asking is not a serious, like we're not asking an actual question. So I can think of some examples of that, but I won't go into all that. But asking the person for clarification about what they are saying to make sure you're understanding them, because they often have a strange answer. They think of the world in different categories. So their answers don't always fit what we think are going to be the typical ones. And that can be a huge gift to us, but it can also cause for awkward moments and a lot of giggles, and then they can feel self-conscious. So how to engage those kind of strange answers that may actually open up a new way of thinking for all of us, but often just are awkward instead. And also then, as we communicate, to check to see what they have heard, because sometimes they have heard something we didn't intend. So doing those kinds of back and forth questions. And finally, I thought that if you are asking more open-ended questions to the whole group, you might want to limit that if you have a person with autism who's speaking too much or too often, because they don't necessarily have those filters. And if they're always being asked the question, they may always respond. And especially at the age of youth, that can increase social difficulties then, because kids tend not to respond well to somebody who always has an answer. So if you know you have someone in your group who is facing an autism spectrum disorder challenge, you might instead invite a specific person to say something. Elsie is asking whether using a talking stick would help the process, and I think that is absolutely correct, that having a chance for each person to say something and not being afraid to say that's enough now. I know, and in some situations, because there's not the normal filters, that a person may say things that make them too vulnerable. And it's okay then to interrupt that person and say, and I know this has happened for my daughter, to say, you know, I think you're going to share something that I think it would be more appropriate if you shared that with me first outside of the group, and then we figure out what we should say to the whole group, so that they aren't exposing themselves in a way that would make them too vulnerable or hurt their relationships with others. But the talking stick idea is a great way to deal with this, to give each person a chance to say something, and it also gives them a chance to pass if they don't feel comfortable speaking. Some people feel very self-conscious about being the center of attention, and that becomes a real difficulty for them if they have to say something or have to perform. So the talking stick gives them the option of passing. Other ideas about how we relate to these communication difficulties?
I'm wondering how others in the youth group can be equipped so that they're not thrown off balance and not afraid to develop friendships and maintain relationships with the participants who've got some level of autism.
Yeah, and that fits right into the second category of characteristics. So I'll hold that question just a bit.
Okay.
Because next one we're going to talk about is social difficulties. And it does very much overlap with communication difficulties. Any other questions or thoughts about how to work with, I mean, I'm assuming a lot here that the people that would be participating would be somewhat verbal. I don't know how many youth groups have worked at integrating young people with more severe communication difficulties. I'm sure that would add some challenges.
I know our youth group has tried to integrate someone with simply Asperger's, which is on the high functioning end of it, and it's flopped. In Sunday school he was okay, but now that he's in youth, he stopped coming to youth, and since then he stopped coming to church, even though the family is highly involved in the life of the church, and it's just very sad.
Yeah. Well, let's go on to the second group of characteristics, and that is the social difficulties. And this, again, is one of those core things that must be present in order for someone to be diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder. The social difficulties can take a range of different forms. It can include just awkwardness on the part of how people relate to others. It might include not understanding nonverbal cues or body language, or sometimes like the unwritten etiquette. Definitely there's often a difficulty developing peer relationships. Some of these young people are able to have quite good relationships with adults or with children, but struggle to relate to their peers. And some of that has to do with the characteristics of youth. I would say that up until middle school, girls who are on the spectrum tend to be taken under the wing of another girl when they're in 3rd or 4th or 5th grade. And somebody will kind of mother them and kind of help them along and help them fit in. But during middle school, the nuances of communication among, especially among girls, change dramatically. And that's where the gap becomes very evident. And middle school becomes a very difficult time for many girls on the spectrum because they are not catching on to the intricacies that the others are developing. It's no longer quite so straightforward. There's much, much more that's hidden, much more that's kind of communicated through a glance, and they may completely miss that. For boys, I think the same gap starts to appear, but somehow our society has made a little more space for the guys and their particular characteristics. I think there's more of a subset there. And it's also true that autism tends to be more common among young men. So often there are struggles definitely in fitting in, but often these young boys are able to find a social peer group that they can connect to. What this leads to is if you're having difficulties with social relationships, it's very difficult to work in groups. And I know the American school system is set up much, much more to do group projects than it used to be. And that can be extremely difficult, especially if kids choose their own groups. Often these kids end up with the groups of kids who don't care at all, and they get very frustrated trying to work in those settings. They might have difficulty expressing their needs. They might have difficulty dealing with conflict. They are often defensive when they're confronted about something. So all of those things make sustaining relationships very difficult. Often young people with autism are completely overwhelmed by crowds. So being around a larger group of people is much more difficult for them than, say, a one-on-one or a very small group. Other examples of social difficulties: they may laugh at inappropriate times, and sometimes that makes them kind of the fun center of a group. Other times it just creates this sense of people are like, they're weird, we don't really know how to deal with them. They may have tantrums or emotional meltdowns. They may prefer to be alone, but not always. Some of them are desperate for connection, and they really, really want to connect. They may not share the same interests as other people, and it's difficult for them to then connect. So what do you do with a young woman who has not yet developed an interest in boys or not yet developed an interest in makeup or whatever? That's not always the case, but sometimes the kinds of things people are interested in does not match up. So some of the social difficulty issues may show up as being inattentive, bored, rude, defiant, or just plain odd. They often don't want the attention of group on them. So yeah, when you kind of call on people, it can actually, for some of them, it creates more difficulties. For others, it's helpful that they know this is their time to speak. Unstructured time is probably the most difficult for people when they aren't given a framework for what they're supposed to be doing or how they're supposed to be relating. They also struggle with unplanned or unannounced activities or changes in the routine. So if you are going, I mean, youth groups have to be flexible, right? Because things often don't happen the way you plan them. But that can really create a tailspin for someone who relies on following the plan that has been made. So you have to find a way to help people make those transitions between what we thought we were going to do and what's actually working out. People with autism are more vulnerable to bullying and harassment because of some of these social things. They're also more vulnerable to being manipulated by others. They can be very vulnerable to peer pressure, resisting it's hard for them to resist the influence of others. And as you can tell, a lot of these social difficulties are connected to communication difficulties. It used to be that people would say that folks with autism spectrum disorders didn't know how to empathize with others. So you get this, I mean, Sheldon Cooper on The Big Bang Theory is kind of the classic example, right, where he really struggles to make sense of other people's feelings. That's very hard for him, and he's obviously been taught how to respond in a way that's more appropriate. But he still doesn't quite know what to do with other people's feelings. However, this has been shown by studies to not be true of everyone, that there are several people, I mean, some people in the spectrum who feel too much, and they actually can over-empathize with other people, and they feel overwhelmed by the pain of the world or the pain of animals, for example. So there is variation in that area. And so some of your young adults or young people with autism spectrum disorders are actually going to be quite good at relating to other folks who are marginalized and have a real heart for people who are marginalized. So Dwight is saying he has a junior high student who has trouble expressing herself. And I'm assuming you're talking about how actually making the communication itself, or is it more kind of putting together a thought and making it coherent? I mean, I think there would be a couple of different ways to understand that, both actually speaking, getting the words out, and then putting things into thought before that. Either way, I think that is true for many people, especially when they are talking about something that is more abstract like faith. Okay, so anything you want to add to the social difficulties? Elsie knows several people who have Asperger's, and they've had a real difficult time fitting into a group. And I think this is a huge challenge for youth groups. And I know far too many kids who have not stuck with it. So are there other things you want to describe in terms of the difficulties before we start talking about how we might address those?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Yes.
Finally. We have a student who has been attending Sunday school every other week, who has trouble socially knowing his boundaries. Like the other month, he was in a small group setting where he laid his head down on the lap of a female student, and his parents we have talked, and they're okay with me saying, Noah, let's not do that. You need to watch your boundaries. So, and he's been very obedient in listening to that. But yeah, I am dealing with helping him to understand his boundaries within the youth group setting.
Yeah, that is a huge thing. Again, there's not necessarily an absorption of seeing what's culturally appropriate. So if they have laid their head on their mother's lap or their father's lap and it's been okay there, they may not see that it's not appropriate with other people. Another example, I mean, you just don't know what they don't know until you face those situations. When my daughter started college, she would just walk in on people in their rooms, and folks had to tell her, you can't do that. You have to knock and have us say you can come in. I had no idea that she hadn't learned that somewhere. And then I thought about, well, in our household, we really didn't close doors much. And so, yeah, there wasn't that sense that your room is your private space that you have to be permitted to enter. And so, yeah, boundaries are a really, really important thing. Thank you for adding that, because there's a lot of different kinds of boundaries, and those definitely fit under the social difficulties theme. Yeah.
I think this will come into the next section again, but it seems that the people who relate to the person with autism, learning to feel comfortable about naming boundaries, which normally it's not considered polite or appropriate for us to say, hey, that's just not okay. Mm-hmm. We make verbal signals or visual signals that indicate our discomfort, which again don't communicate, right? So that can you add more on equipping others to feel okay about that?
So I think definitely the most important thing we can do with youth groups to help them address these issues is to have open conversations, and hopefully the families and the youth who are affected will be okay with that. And I know that varies from family to family. We chose very early on to start disclosing this information and using it. We shared it with classrooms without her there. We shared it with the youth group without her there, so that the youth could ask questions. Her peers could ask whatever they wanted to say without the fear of embarrassing her more. And she was okay with us doing that. that's an ongoing issue throughout life. Do you tell a potential employer what you struggle with?
Yeah, exactly.
It's just a huge, huge issue. But in order to get the kind of supports that you need to be successful, you kind of have to explain why some of these things are the way they are. And I have found that especially younger kids, but junior hires as well, and somewhat in the high school age group, respond very well if they understand why someone is the way they are. And they can be amazingly compassionate. Sometimes there's one or two people in the group that are especially good at that, and you can ask them to be kind of a buddy, but you don't want to wear out one or two people either. So it's great if the whole group can kind of take that on, but you do kind of have to, as a leader, watch for, is this person being left out? And it's harder if there's only a few of that gender and everybody else, if all the boys are really athletic except this one, how do you help them fit in? Sometimes bigger groups are easier, sometimes they're not. It just depends on the makeup of your group and the people that are in it. It can become a great learning opportunity for youth groups to talk about how did Jesus relate to those who were at the margins. But it's really, really countercultural for our kids to do this. So it is an opportunity to learn about faith that makes a difference compared to how people relate in our society. So I am a big proponent of doing education, of talking about it, and it's great then if there's a time where the youth can come back into the group and people can learn directly from them. So, for example, they might be given the chance to say, what do you think your strengths are because of your autism spectrum disorder? What are your biggest challenges? What do you wish people would help you with? And give them a chance to speak directly to their peers if they're open to doing that. We also found that in our church setting that it was really important that the mentor system that we have, having an adult who could accept our daughter just the way she was and always relate to her, that was a key place where she plugged in to our church and still connects to our church through her mentor, even though she's been out of high school for 5 years now. So that having a network of people that they can connect with. In really severe cases where the youth says, I do not feel comfortable in this group, do not want to be part of it, then I would ask, is there a group other than a peer group that they could connect to? And why do we feel that it has to be, that people have to be with their peers when they're youth, when everyone else relates across ages? So, I think work with the person to figure out who do they feel comfortable relating to in the congregation and keep trying to expand that group, but don't limit yourself to saying it has to be just the other youth if it's clearly not working. I think that in terms of some specific ideas, if you're doing a group activity and you see that this person is having a hard time just kind of even entering the activity, you need to be sensitive to that, help them figure out how they can participate. If you're doing something in pairs, try assigning the partners or helping them find a partner so that they're not always the one left out. Talking with them about the gifts they bring to the group and building on those. If you're doing physical games, to be aware that sometimes people with autism spectrum disorder struggle with physical coordination as well, and it may be difficult for them to play some of the games or frustrating for them. They're always the first one out. So what could their role be if they're the first one out always? And also then giving good instructions so that they know how to participate appropriately and monitoring it carefully. So those are some of the ideas I had. What other ideas do you bring?
I'll just add one thing from my observance of an outreach group called House Blend in Winnipeg. It's a household for marginalized people to live there. And on Tuesday, yeah, it's mainly young adults. On Tuesday nights, they have a potluck, and then a simple but structured liturgy afterwards, which they take from the Book of Common Prayer. And it seems to be a uniquely effective way of including young adults and older adults with a variety of disabilities. And it's a combination of this potluck, and they don't complain if it turns out to be all salads one week or whatever. It's just very informal, and then they gather and share their highs and lows of the week in the frame of a set short liturgy.
That's awesome.
So they have a Facebook page, House Blend it's called, and there's some really neat things there. And it's the place that I've encouraged this young man from our church to go and check out, because it's okay to be different and to be quirky in that place, and in ways that in our churches just hasn't been shown to be the case.
Yeah. Yeah. Another thing that I didn't speak directly to yet in terms of things we can do that help is to try to create as much structure as possible so that they know what to expect, or they know that even if they're warned, there might be unexpected things that are going to happen. Helping them through transitions. Those are also part of helping them with the social difficulties.
And what about handles to help them with things that are sexually inappropriate? Mm-hmm. Because I can see the situation Dwight described as leading to situations where a person feels they're being sexually abused, right, whereas the person with autism isn't catching on that this is not okay.
Right, and it can go both ways. These kids can be prodded to do things by others and not realize that, oh, this is going to get me in trouble. Yeah. Or they can be prodded to do things that actually make them the victim. And then they can just do things without really realizing, or they may have seen it on TV and thought it was okay. So I think, again, having to be very clear, and that's where I think you need a good partnership between the family, the parents, and the youth leaders to, before someone gets to high school, they need to know what boundaries are appropriate. So I know in our autism parent group, we did at least, 4 or 5 sessions over the 9 years on sexual boundaries and helping our kids learn about boundaries, because it's not an easy thing given the cultural influences that we have. When Anna first started dating, I made a 6-foot timeline with her. Each inch was for 1 month, and we lined out what. Then I made sticky notes with a number of different ways that people share physical intimacy, and talked about how she might want to space these out so that she wasn't rushing into some kind of an intimacy that was not going to be healthy for the relationship or her. And so by thinking through how long would you wait before you take that next step, and really breaking it down into very specific things. So we talked about each one of these. What does it mean to pet above the clothing? Each step along the way, and helping her think about how to develop a relationship in more than just the physical sense, so that she would be empowered to be able to say no to things if she didn't feel ready for them. And that 6-foot timeline was a very concrete, visible way for her to then grapple with, like, okay, she was 15 at the time, so what does this time period look like before you are through your education and ready to enter into a more stable relationship. So, you know, it was one tool. There's a number of different ways to do it, but I do know, unfortunately, I know of too many stories where kids have either others or been violated because they were not clearly instructed on what was and was not appropriate. And you just honestly have to think of every possibility. You just don't know. The same as if they start to learn to drive. You have to help them constantly think of every single thing that might come up. We would drive together and say, what would you do if an animal ran across the road right now? Section. What might happen at this intersection? What might happen as we drive through this neighborhood? What do you need to be aware of? What do you need to be watching for? Whether it's car doors opening or children or animals or whatever it is, just to help them think through every single possibility. And you know what? We still didn't. We didn't think of the possibility that somebody who had never learned how to drive would say, please let me drive your car. So, you know, you can't think of it all, but you have to think of as many things as possible. You have to put things in writing. We had papers in the glove compartment that said, if I'm in an accident, if I damage another person's property with my car, these are the steps to follow, so that it was all written out and everything was there. You just have to try to think of all these possibilities. So yeah, with sexual boundaries, you have to be very explicit and name, these things are not appropriate. This is how you can relate to people. How do you ask permission to give a hug? Or how do you respond when someone else comes to hug you? I mean, sometimes the rules can actually then catch them and they feel paralyzed because other people aren't following the rules we've given them. It's just a very complicated thing. Absolutely.
What a gift you are, Janeen, to your daughter in walking through that. That's wonderful, and being so open and yeah, steady. That's such a gift.
I'm aware that we're nearing the end of the time we gave, so I want to just quickly go through the other things here. Third characteristic is limited or focused interest. So sometimes people have a specific kind of interest or activity that they're very engaged in and preoccupied with. Sometimes that's a mannerism, such as hand flapping or rocking. That's called stimming, self-stimulation. Other times you'll just have somebody that knows everything there is to know about trains or about animals or dinosaurs or whatever. How that might affect a youth program, I think if you know that something is really important to someone, you can try to use that to engage them in an activity, but it's okay to put a time limit on that too. They need to know that they can talk about this for 1 minute and then it's going to be time to return to the other conversation. In terms of stimming, generally people say don't interrupt those unless they're truly disruptive to the group, but it's okay to offer alternatives. So if they're doing something that really is distracting, you might offer them a stress ball to do it instead or something else. The fourth characteristic is stimuli sensitivities, just sensory issues. They might be oversensitive or undersensitive to pain, noise, light, smells, or touch. For example, they might resist hugs, they might have problems with coarse clothing, they might be overly bothered by loud music or sounds, or be overwhelmed by crowds or too much sensory stimulation. And on the positive side, they may notice details that other people overlook. So how does that affect a youth program? You might want to allow earplugs or sunglasses if those are helpful. Check about their comfort level with touch, so that you know, do they want to be touched or not. Invite them to have a small sensory item with them in order to help them do the squeezing they need or do the movement they need. And then you have to deal with some of these really difficult situations, like what do you do on a group outing, especially like at convention, where it's overstimulating to everyone. So that's in our situation, we made an exit plan that if things got to be too much, there would be a signal like I'm up to here or it's too much, just kind of, and they would give that so that only the youth leader would know that they needed to get away or that they were getting close to that. And then they had a safe place. They were to go to the nearest restroom, and an adult would follow them of the same gender and make sure they were safe, but not necessarily kind of go right into their space. Give them the level of space to decompress. So you have to work out what are you going to do when there's too much stimulation, and sometimes it may not be possible for them to participate in the big events like convention. And then the fifth theme or characteristic is anxiety. This is not always present, but about 80% of people with autism spectrum disorders also have pretty significant anxiety. And part of that is because they read the world differently than everyone else. That can include all kinds of things like panic attacks, aggressiveness, loneliness, difficulty concentrating. I mean, there's so many different things, flight or fight responses. There can be physical symptoms. A lot of those seem almost like, things you'd be really worried about, but it's actually anxiety can cause the heart to race. It can cause headaches, muscle pain, inability of sleeping, all those things. And you don't always know what the triggers are, but it's not knowing socially what other people are thinking about them, kind of a paranoia. It's the events that aren't planned or aren't announced, the changes in the schedule. It's making those adjustments. Sometimes it's just even having to talk to friends. So those kinds of things all can create anxiety. So as a youth leader, you might try to be aware of what are the common triggers for the person you're working with and see if there are ways to avoid them as much as possible. If they have an anxiety attack, don't take it personally. Stay present with them. Be patient. Show they care. Help them find appropriate responses to their anxiety so they're not lashing out at others. If they have a panic attack, it's helpful to focus on their breathing, just to slow them down, to count to 10 as they breathe, and then use some tools such as either being physically active, squeezing something, being alone. For some people, sleep is important. For some people, they want to talk it out. Others need a pet. There's all kinds of different ways that people can reduce their anxiety. But it's not possible for them just to snap out of it just because we say, oh, it's okay, don't be anxious. I mean, this is a whole big topic, and it's probably true for a lot of kids that don't have autism spectrum disorders as well, so maybe it's a topic for another webinar. But I would say that this becomes almost more difficult for many of these kids to deal with than the autism itself, is dealing with the anxiety levels that they face. And then just the final thing I'll say is just as youth leaders to be aware of how this affects the family as well. The family often is facing a lot of stress because of the kids hold it together until they come home at night and then they blow up or they fall apart. And so families often face more difficulty than the school teachers do, for example. They might have financial stresses due to medications or treatments. Sometimes a parent is reducing their workload in order to care for the family member. And then there's also the whole reality of family or parental grief, because what they dreamed for their child is not, they can see this is not going to be what I hoped. Even though you want to focus on what's good, there is still that sense of loss. So just to be aware, the stress on the family as well, and to have somebody in the church that's connecting with the family members as well to make sure they have the support they need. I know we started late, so I don't know how long. I know Elsie had to leave early. I don't know if the rest of you want to ask questions. I'm available to go a little longer, but I want to respect the time frame that we were given. So I'll turn it back to Rachel and see whether you and Dwight have questions.
Thanks. Dwight, do you have any questions?
I don't know that I have any questions except to say I have two junior hires on the autism spectrum, and then the young man that I talked about earlier. Then we have two more students in 4th and 5th grade who will be coming into our youth ministry on the autism spectrum. And everything you described, I see in all of those kids. I think the hard, or I don't know if it's hard, but what I need to be aware of is that they don't all show all those signs, that each one of them show some of those signs and how to relate to each one of them differently in where they are as individuals.
Excellent point. Excellent. Exactly.
Well, I think this has been so helpful, Janine, and I think that's one of the best pastoral things that we can do for folks in our congregations that have autism is to learn about what autism is and what are some ways that we can help walk alongside them and understand them. And like you said at the beginning, that if how many ways what did you say exactly? However, what is autism? How it's so unique for each individual person. I think that is so helpful, but also realizing what does it mean for pastoral care to walk with the families as well and keep those open lines of communication. So I'm so grateful for you taking the time today to talk with the Gathering Place, and also ADNET, which is Anabaptist Disabilities Network. Has an amazing website that's full of resources for individual families and congregations to use. I think is a really wonderful place to go. And it's adnetonline.org is their website. And we'll actually be having a live podcast with the executive director and program director next week on Thursday at 1 o'clock. So if anyone else wants to join us for that, feel free. But thanks again, Janine and Dwight and Elsie and those of you who are viewing it now. And yeah, to be continued.
Yes.
To be continued. So I hope you all have a wonderful day, and thanks again for this very helpful information.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Janine. We'll see ya. Bye-bye.